That evening, Scott ate nothing but a stack of biscuits. "You should have bought some food in that town," Lambo said. Scott shrugged. "I forgot." "What about that thief?" Lambo asked. "Aren't you worried he'll starve?" Scott answered casually. "Wizards don't starve that easily. If you're worried, get the crows to feed him some bugs." After finishing the biscuits, he climbed onto the wooden house's roof and opened the water tank. Aguamenti. A steady stream of clear water poured from the tip of his wand and quickly refilled the tank. "Now I can have a proper bath." Night passed. As the sun rose and warmed the forest, Scott, still in pajamas, sat on the floor by the door and stretched. "Good morning, Lambo." He smiled up at the flying goat. Lambo tossed a handful of wild berries into his arms and landed on the windowsill. "Thanks." Scott sniffed the berries, went inside to wash them, and tasted one. A bit sour, he frowned, but better than nothing. From the windowsill, Lambo called, "Scott, a crow has returned. It's the one that went to Nocturne Alley." Scott set the berries on a plate and went back to sit in the doorway. A crow flew in and landed on the floor under the sill, cawing at Lambo for a long while. Lambo cawed back and the bird obediently flew away. Lambo reported, "The crows couldn't find Mr. Borgin's exact house from outside. After Borgin and Burke's closed up, he left through a fireplace inside the shop." "That makes things tricky," Scott said, leaning back against the doorframe as he chewed a berry. "It's difficult," Lambo agreed. "The crows can only watch from outside, and so can I. It wouldn't be wise to blunder into Borgin and Burke's." Scott nodded. "It's not impossible." "You have a plan?" Lambo asked. Scott looked at him. "Transfiguration can do it. I'll make the poison get into his mouth on its own." Lambo cocked his head. "The same poison that killed Travers?" "Ricin." Scott stood. "Let me try." He went into the house and sat at the desk. Lambo hopped onto the lamp and watched. Scott put a sheet of parchment on the desk, took out a Transfiguration lizard skin bag, and from it produced a sealed vial and some candies. "You're going to poison him with candy?" Lambo fretted. "I don't like this." Scott didn't answer. He unwrapped a candy, removed its translucent rice paper wrapper, and smiled. "This is perfect." He folded several small squares of rice paper and arranged them neat and flat. They melt in the mouth, ideal for an outer layer. Lambo stared. "You're horrifying, my friend." "Thank you," Scott said dryly. He put on a medical mask and a pair of dragonhide gloves for protection. Carefully, he scraped the wax seal off the vial, transfigured a wild berry stem into a tiny spoon, and scooped the fine white powder onto the rice paper. He folded a dozen small packets, each filled with enough white powder to be lethal. He resealed the vial and set it aside. Working with slow, precise movements, Scott folded a few more packets into the shape he wanted. Now the critical part. He took off the dragonhide gloves, gripped his wand, and cast his most practiced transfiguration. One of the little packets on the parchment changed into a large midge. He tapped his wand, and each of the dozen packets became a midge, large, alive insects crawling across the parchment. Lambo peered down. "What's the point of this? Does Mr. Borgin eat bugs like crows?" "It isn't finished yet." Scott waved his wand again and chanted a shrinking charm over the midges. The light wrapped them, and they shrank, from fly-sized to tiny black specks barely visible on the parchment. Lambo stretched his neck, watching the moving dots. "They'll crawl into someone's nostrils or mouth, not surprisingly, except mine." That had been the behavior Scott set when he transfigured them. They would seek out warm, moist places in a person's face. "You just need to find a time when Borgin is alone and there are no customers," Scott told Lambo. "Release them inside the shop and wait." "No problem," Lambo agreed. "I can do that." Scott waved his wand, and the parchment folded itself into a matchbox that held the tiny midges. "I'll wait here for your good news," he said, taking out another nut. "And don't forget today's daily profit." Lambo took the matchbox and the coin, grumbling fondly. "I'm happy to help, but you sure gather a lot of trouble." "Thanks, you've been a great help." Scott smiled. Lambo flew out the window with the matchbox. Scott used a movement charm to send the dragonhide gloves and the small spoon he had used to handle the powder outside, then called Incendio. A fierce flame burned the spoon to ash, while the dragonhide gloves, made to resist heat and contamination, remained unharmed. He snuffed the fire, boxed the gloves, and decided to keep them only for future contact with poison. With that finished, he turned to his summer homework. He wrote the essay the potions professor had assigned and finished before Lambo returned, accompanied by the flock of crows he'd sent to keep watch. Was it successful? Scott asked. Lambo handed him a copy of the Daily Prophet. Yes, I did it. Borgin, the owner of Borgin and Burke's in Nocturne Alley, is dead. He collapsed on the counter. The weight in Scott's chest lifted at last. A genuine smile spread across his face. Lambo immediately began to excitedly recount the details. Scott listened to Lambo's report with satisfaction. Following Scott's instructions, Lambo had gone to Nocturne Alley, landed at the front of Borgin and Burke's while it was empty, slipped open the matchbox with its claws, and flown to the rooftop opposite the shop. From there it watched. Not long after, Mr. Borgin collapsed inside the shop. He tried to call for help but couldn't raise his voice. He tried to crawl out but lost the ability to move. The dose of poison Scott had prepared was large. Borgin died quickly, with no chance to save himself. No one noticed at the time, Lambo told Scott. People in Nocturne Alley don't dare to provoke Mr. Borgin. They won't even look into his shop. After that incident, it was a long time before anyone found out what happened. Well done, Scott said, stroking Lambo's wings. You've been a tremendous help. Lambo preened, proud. Ha ha! Scott, what would you do without me? Scott kept praising the creature until it was exuberant. Then, when Lambo asked about his reason for killing Borgin and Burke's, the conversation turned practical. Is that enough, Scott? Lambo asked. What if Borgin had other wizard allies and someone else still tries to get your Marauder's map? Scott considered it. That's unlikely. Borgin was greedy. He wouldn't have shared the secret of the map, and I don't think even that thief Fletch knew the map's true origin. He nodded at Lambo's decision to leave a few ravens behind. It was wise to leave birds watching Nocturne Alley, just in case. Still, Scott knew the situation wasn't entirely resolved. There were two lingering questions. First, as Lambo had warned, did Borgin have accomplices who might have known something? That could only be answered by continued surveillance. Second, the small fireplace Medea had set up as a kind of local network. Did she know what had happened within it? Scott was fairly sure Borgin had acted on his own and not at Medea's command, but he couldn't be certain whether Medea, as owner of the network, had been aware. Since she hadn't appeared or contacted him through the fireplace, he assumed she didn't know. He set the matter aside for now. There was one more person to deal with. Scott flew down on his broom from the treetops and approached the oak where Fleck lay. The thief was prostrate and gaunt from 2 days without food or water, blindfolded and gagged. His lips were cracked. He couldn't even whimper. Scott drew his wand and aimed at Fleck's head, hesitated, and lowered it again. I could give you a memory charm and release you, he said quietly, as if to himself. Charms can force someone to forget, but those memories can return. Fletch began to struggle suddenly, finding strength somewhere. Scott muttered more aloud, partly to justify his next move. This whole thing worked because my mother hasn't been in contact with my uncle for some time, so no one knows about my connection to the Hill family. Out of arrogance toward Muggles, neither you nor Borgin bothered to investigate the Hills, otherwise you'd have found me. He looked down at the bound thief. If that had happened, I'd have been exposed. He paused. For security's sake, and as a precaution, Mr. Thief Fletch, please stay silent forever. Fletch wailed and writhed, chains clanking. Scott flicked his wand. Engorgement charm. Lambo swelled to a gigantic size. Take him away, just as you said, Scott told it. Whether it's the wolf pack or the troll tribe, in the end, you still use my method, don't you? Lambo teased as it gripped the chains and hauled Fletch up into the air. Fletch's cries turned into screams as Lambo carried him off. Scott didn't watch. He knew his nature. To continue in magic, he would sometimes have to kill. He preferred not to do the killing with his own hands, or by using his own magic directly, so the act would be less traceable, less likely to change him in a way others could perceive. In a strict sense, he was exploiting a loophole. Lambo returned quickly. Is he dead? Scott asked. He's dead, Lambo said plainly. I threw him to the wolf pack. Scott retrieved Fletch's wand from the small, deformed lizard skin bag. Do me a favor later, he said. Drop his wand back where he died, and leave the chain somewhere else. Lambo agreed, and Scott rode his broom back to the wooden house to read the Daily Prophet. Sirius Black was still headline news. The papers tracked and reported on him as if to trumpet the ministry's triumph, while Black himself looked ready to lash out at any reporter in the photographs. Scott skimmed the roundups about Black and Pettigrew until a smaller, odd article caught his eye. Jack Yaxley, Wizard of the Yaxley family, wins All England Wizard Dueling Championship. The Dueling Championship's prestige had been fading, and the article read to Scott like it had an agenda. The piece struck him as curious. Jack Yaxley? Scott stared at the photograph in the paper. Jack Yaxley, mid-celebration, grinning with a trophy in his hands. He looked impossibly young, no more than in his 20s, even younger than Brandon Yaxley, who had once attacked Scott. To win the All-Britain Wizard Dueling Championship at that age, he had to be formidable. Lambo's Ravens kept close watch on members of the Yaxley family, so Scott already knew the basics. Jack was 25, had left Slytherin at Hogwarts 8 years ago, and was the youngest son of his generation. Scott read the article more carefully. Report by Peyton Sudworth, staff reporter. The recently concluded All-Britain Wizard Dueling Championship has come to a successful end. This historic event, Jack Yaxley, a young man of the pure-blood Yaxley family, only 25 years old, defeated his powerful opponent, 45-year-old Caramore Rosier, in the final to claim this year's championship. Incredible, people at the match had said. He's an exceptionally talented young man. Even Severus Snape, now the Slytherin head of house, was quoted expressing pride in his former student. Mr. Yaxley is the youngest genius among all past dueling champions. He is the pride of Slytherin, Snape said in an interview. The champion himself had been polite and modest after the match, crediting his family and his school for his success. More importantly, he had added, I have both Yaxley and Travers bloodlines. My mother is from the Travers family. The writer went on, fawning. The author believes this young dueling champion, this highly praised genius, Mr. Jack Yaxley, who carries the bloodlines of 2 of the Sacred 28, has once again proven the superiority of pure-blood families. Scott stopped reading when the article dissolved into praise for pure-blood privilege and set the paper down. He sighed. It seemed the All-Britain Championship no longer stood for true glory. It had never been as prestigious as the All-Europe Dueling Championship Flitwick once won, but it had been a popular event in Britain's magical community. Now it was barely noticed. Results only made the profit by the time the champion was decided, and not even on the front page. Scott remembered Flitwick's disgruntled mutterings about the competition being corrupted by pure-blood families who used money and influence to shape the outcome, turning the championship into nothing more than an internal game. The thought made Scott smile bitterly. 2 small paragraphs in the report were more telling than the rest. From them, Scott could read the Yaxley family's intent. Although Jack was the youngest son and not in line to inherit, the family had clearly put him forward as a candidate for the Travers heirship. The article was essentially a campaign piece, emphasizing his bloodlines as though promoting an asset. I didn't expect them to be so blatant, Scott murmured. 25 was unusually old to be chosen as an heir candidate. Families typically favored youngsters who had only recently manifested magic. Picking an adult like Jock was brazen, even for the pure bloods. Scott found the maneuver intriguing and wondered how the other families would counter. He was looking forward to the contest heating up. At noon, Lambo carried him into the small town of Callander. Scott had lunch at a local restaurant, bought provisions at the market, and called his parents to assure them he was safe. In the afternoon, one of Lambo's ravens brought fresh news from Nocturne Alley. Borgin and Burks had died suddenly. The ministry, which rarely paid attention to Nocturne Alley, had sent Aurors to investigate and concluded it was poisoning. They had found no further leads. Scott had expected that. For wizards, a quiet death could be arranged without grand displays of magic. Direct attacks were too conspicuous. He wasn't worried about being linked to the disappearance of the thief, Mundungus Felch, either. As an underground dealer in fence, Mundungus was slippery and kept his movements secret. The only person who knew he'd been heading to Spain had been Borgin, and Borgin was dead. People would assume Mundungus had simply gone off on another job or been killed while stealing. They wouldn't trace anything back to Scott. Scott had never done business with him. There was no reason to get involved. He had promised his parents he'd be back in Madrid before his birthday, and that no one would know he'd spent his summer in Britain. When the Raven relayed the Nocturne Alley news, Scott was sitting on the floor by the door with a thick notebook in his lap. After listening, he said, "I'm going to hide my cabin with a charm." Lambo blinked. "There's such a charm?" "Of course." Scott stared at his own cramped handwriting across the page. Fidelius charm. He had copied the notes from the Hogwarts and Ravenclaw libraries, difficult, rarely used charms. The Fidelius charm was one of the most complex. It hid a secret in the very soul of a living person. The secret rested inside the secret keeper's heart and could never be discovered unless the secret keeper chose to reveal it. If he could place his cabin under a Fidelius, no one could perceive it, even if they pressed their noses against the windows. "Can you manage such a charm?" Lambo asked, curious. "I haven't tried yet," Scott said, flipping through pages of incantations and diagrams. "I'm studying it." Then, he bent his head back into the notebook, tracing complicated runes and rehearsing the theory aloud. In Scott's view, the Fidelius charm was less a simple enchantment and more an ancient ritual. It had to be performed on a new moon night, and it required rare components. He did the math and grinned. "Perfect. 2 days from now is a new moon. I'll attempt it then." He checked the list once more. Moonstone for the moon, Demagui's blood for concealment, roses for keeping secrets, and water from the river Leith for forgetting. Lambo listened and shook his head. "None of that grows in the forest." "If I mail order any of it, I'd have to give my name," Scott said, "so I'll have to go to Diagon Alley." "You said you can't let anyone know you're in Britain over the summer," Lambo reminded him. Scott laughed. "Of course, I'll be disguised." "Can you take me to London?" Scott asked. "Of course," Lambo replied, "but be ready. It's a long trip, at least 3 hours at full speed." They left early the next morning. Scott kept his eyes covered as usual until they were clear of the forest. To avoid being seen from below, Lambo flew unusually high. The air thinned. Scott asked him to slow and to let him put on another coat. When he glimpsed the world below, he couldn't help but shout, "Now, accelerate!" Lambo answered with a cry and shot forward like an arrow. The runic circuit strapped to him boosted his speed far beyond that of any ordinary bird. Scott hugged his neck, the wind stinging his face. He didn't know how long they flew, and every minute felt like punishment, until finally they passed over London, and Lambo found the alley that hid Diagon Alley. Scott drew the severed arm bone in his wand and muttered a disillusionment charm over himself and Lambo. They descended into an empty service alley. Scott rubbed his numb face, shrank Lambo down, and stowed the little creature in his shape-changing lizard skin bag. Then he set about the disguise. He took 2 bottles of polyjuice potion from the leather bag, divided a strand of hair into 2 parts, and put a piece into each bottle. He drank one of the bottles. "1 bottle lasts at most an hour," he reminded himself, slipping the other into his pocket. Because Borgin and Burke's death was still under investigation, Scott didn't risk stealing a face from a stranger. He'd borrowed Roger's appearance instead. That way, if anyone who knew Roger was present, at least it would be plausible. He crossed a couple of streets and pushed open the door of the Leaky Cauldron. The pub fell quiet when he entered, then murmured back to life when people realized who had come in. Scott felt eyes on him. Most of the patrons were pretending to drink while glancing his way. "Good morning, customer," Tom the innkeeper called, coming around the bar and wiping his rough hands on a dirty apron. He peered at Scott. "Are you a Hogwarts student?" "Morning, Tom. Just passing through, on my way to Diagon Alley." Scott kept his tone casual. Tom eyed him a beat and waved him onward. "All right, then. Remembered you. Go on through." At Tom's words, the lingering stares shifted away more fully. Scott feigned confusion. "Did something happen?" Tom leaned in close and lowered his voice. "Just yesterday, a wizard in Nocturne Alley was found dead. We're all a bit jumpy about strangers these days." "Nocturne Alley?" Scott said. He knew the place's reputation for shadowy types and dangerous dealings. "People do die there sometimes, don't they?" Tom gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Not wrong to say so, but the one who was killed the day before yesterday wasn't just anyone. That was Borgin, owner of Borgin and Burke's, a nasty piece of work, even for Nocturne." Scott nodded. I was just going to buy some potion ingredients in Diagon Alley. Diagon's safe enough, Tom said with a small smile. Scott went straight to Slug and Jigger's apothecary. He bought a mountain of supplies, mixing in the few specific ingredients he needed for the ritual. Welcome back next time, the shopkeeper said as Scott left. Bags in every hand, Scott consolidated them into one smaller leather bag and scanned the street. At the entrance to Diagon Alley, he spotted a familiar figure, Professor Severus Snape. Walking beside him was the young dueling champion whose face Scott had seen in the paper the day before, Jock Yaxley. Seeing the two of them together made him uneasy. He slipped into Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. Snape was the last person who'd consider coming in there. More than anything, Scott didn't want to be close to Snape, a potion master who might notice something off about the polyjuice. Even though Barty Crouch Jr. had famously impersonated Mad-Eye Moody with polyjuice without being detected, Scott didn't want to tempt fate. From his table, spoons stilled in the air, Scott watched Snape and Jack walk into the very shop where he'd just been. Why would Snape be seen with Jack Yaxley? The newspapers had printed pleasant things about Snape, praising Jack. Scott had assumed it was polite distance. Snape was not the sort to wade into family disputes, and he certainly wouldn't risk being read as supporting the Yaxleys. The sight of them together didn't add up. Worry was useless. There was only one sensible move. He finished his ice cream, rose, and headed toward the leaky cauldron with quick, purposeful steps. His best bet was to slip out of Diagon Alley before Snape noticed him and avoid an awkward greeting, or worse, an inspection. He was halfway down the lane when a voice called his name, loud and clear. Roger! He didn't look back. He walked faster. Scott ignored the shouts behind him and kept walking until he reached the wall that led into the leaky cauldron. He was just tapping the bricks with his wand when a kindly, middle-aged witch came up and patted his shoulder. Young man, that pretty girl seems to be calling you, she said with a smile. Scott had actually sensed her approach, but he didn't move aside. Dodging now would have been too obvious. He glanced helplessly at the open gap in the wall, then turned to look down the street. A girl was running toward him. He thanked the witch. Thank you, madam. You're welcome. A good boy shouldn't make a girl sad. The woman winked and walked away. Scott clicked his tongue as Caccini, Roger's recently broken-up ex, came barreling up. Roger, she panted, breathless and flushed from running. Hello, Caccini. Scott forced a polite smile. He was trying to keep his composure, though his heart was racing. This was the last thing he'd wanted to deal with. Why did you run? I don't believe you didn't hear me, she demanded. Do you really not want to see me? Scott met the hurt in her eyes and felt a cold prickle down his arm. He'd been trying to keep a low profile. The whole situation felt absurd. When he stayed silent, Caccini's eyes filled. You really are heartless, Roger, she accused, and the curious looks of passers-by made Scott squirm. Ahem. Calm down, Caccini, he said softly. Come on, I'll take you for a drink at the leaky cauldron. He tapped the bricks behind him. They slid aside and he led her inside. They sat up at the counter. Tom was wiping the bar with a rag. Young man, I was wondering why a student would come here so soon after the summer holidays, he said, teasing. So it's a date, he chuckled, eyeing Scott and Caccini. What a nice couple. Scott's face burned. Caccini, having gathered herself, gave Tom a grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Tom. Tom tossed the rag aside. You're welcome. What can I get you to? An elderflower cordial, Caccini said. Scott put down the ice cream he'd been eating, now half melted. A peppermint iced water, he answered. Tom brought the drinks quickly, but the two of them sat in awkward silence. Scott kept shoveling down his ice cream, silently willing Caccini to leave. She clung to her glass and kept glancing at him. Sensing the tension, Tom left them alone with a cheerful parting. Once he was gone, Scott felt even more uncomfortable, as if his toes had dug into the floor to anchor him. After a long, strained minute, Scott finished his ice cream and half the iced water. Caccini sighed. Roger, don't you have anything to say to me? Huh? Scott tried to look bewildered. He mainly wanted her to storm off so he could be done with the situation. You're playing dumb, Roger, she snapped through gritted teeth. I'm a girl, and I came to find you on my own. Scott kept his confused expression. Caccini drew deep, shaking breaths, trying not to cry. I should have known, Roger. You're that kind of boy. I should have seen it when I saw Mill. She pushed herself off the stool and added softly, I shouldn't have thought I was special to you. She shot him a look full of scorn and stumbled away. Scott didn't even have a moment to apologize. He simply let out a huge internal sigh of relief as her figure disappeared down the street. Tom reappeared behind the counter, polishing a glass. Kid, don't let a good girl down, or you'll regret it later, he advised. I regret it now, Scott thought, but his regret was complicated. He'd been borrowing Roger's face to avoid drawing attention, and that choice had backfired. If he'd used Eddie's or Milton's appearance instead, he wouldn't be stuck in this mess. But he hadn't, and now he had to deal with the consequences. It's nothing. We broke up a long time ago, he said aloud. He left some coins for the drinks and stepped back into the alley where Lambo waited. Let's go, back, he told the creature. He reactivated the severed arm bone, used it to enlarge Lambo, and cast a disillusionment charm over both himself and the mount. He climbed on, and Lambo surged into the sky. 3 hours later, wind-stung and tired, Scott returned to Raven territory and climbed into the small cabin. He didn't rest long. He carefully put away the potion ingredients he'd bought, took out his cauldron, knives, and other tools, and began the initial processing. He ate a quick lunch and then set to work preparing what he would need for the Fidelius charm ritual and the potion that accompanied it. Moonstones had to be ground to a fine powder, Demiguy's blood needed to be chilled but not frozen, River Styx water required constant boiling, and roses had to be steamed in the vapor above the River Styx water. By evening, he had processed enough for a single potion. Tomorrow I can try brewing the actual thing, he muttered, stretching and stifling a yawn. He managed to put together a hearty dinner from the limited supplies and spent the meal going over the steps of the ritual in his head. He knew his potion skills were modest. Getting this far, getting the ingredients prepared correctly, was already an achievement. Success on the first try would be nice, but not something he could count on. One chapter remains to be posted, update coming before 8 a.m. tomorrow. The next day, Scott's first attempt at making the potion failed, as he'd expected. He calmly prepared another set of ingredients and began again. When fine moonstone powder meets cold Demiguy's blood, the mixture keeps cooling and must be stirred constantly to prevent freezing. At no point can fire be used to heat it. Heat will turn the Demiguy's blood black and ruin it. Scott managed this step without incident. After he mixed the white moonstone powder into the blue blood, the color began to change. When it works, the hue lightens. When it fails, it darkens. Scott held the stirring rod in his right hand and his wand in his left, stirring quickly while channeling a steady stream of magic into the mixture. Slowly, the moonstone dissolved in the crystal cup, and the blood thinned to a watery, moonlit color. On the table, the cauldron simmered with forgetfulness potion, a gauze stretched over its mouth containing 3 roses. Scott set the stabilized, watery blood aside and moved on to the next step. He put on a fresh pair of dragonhide gloves, removed the gauze, and squeezed the roses until a small bottle of pale red liquid had been extracted. The scent of roses filled the air, carrying a faint clarity of mind. He removed his gloves and slowly poured the light red liquid into the cold, watery blood. The hot liquid hissed when it met the cold, and a violent reaction rippled through the cup. The red rolled through the liquid, and a bubble rose to the surface. Scott picked up the stirring rod and wand again, stirring relentlessly and feeding magic into the mixture until the reaction subsided. When the liquid finally calmed and ran clear, he let out a long breath. His first attempt had failed at this exact point. He hadn't been able to control the reaction in time, and both substances had vaporized. Once you get past this step, the rest is straightforward. Pour the blended liquid into the forgetfulness potion in the cauldron, boil for 24 hours, and stir clockwise 7 times every 3 hours. Compared to other rare concoctions, this ritual potion wasn't difficult, and its ingredients weren't expensive. Scott suspected that's why the ancient ritual magic it supports had survived to the present. He poured the clear liquid into the cauldron and performed the first clockwise stir. Then he sat on the floor by the door and began reading the Daily Prophet, both yesterday's paper, which he hadn't had time to read after returning from London, and the new issue. As he'd expected, yesterday's front page screamed, "Shocking in Nocturne Alley. Mr. Borgin of Borgin and Burke's dies mysteriously from poisoning." Reported by Basil Hollingworth, staff reporter. Around 11:40 a.m. on June 17th, Mr. Borgin, owner of Borgin and Burke's in Nocturne Alley, was found dead inside his shop. Ministry of Magic aurors investigating the scene say the cause of death was poisoning. This is a poison potent enough to fatally affect a wizard in a short time, an auror assisting the investigation told this reporter. He said healers found traces of poison in the deceased's mouth. Aurors have confirmed that no one else entered or left the shop at the time, and that there were no signs of a struggle. They have ruled out the wizards who visited Borgin and Burke's that morning as suspects, though those visitors may face fines from the Legal Enforcement Squad for suspected dark arts transactions. A senior ministry auror told this reporter, "Although it looks like Borgin took the poison himself, it's clear that the crafty old man would never do something so foolish." This reporter spoke to several witnesses. The prevailing theory is that someone entered through the shop's fireplace, used a dark curse, Imperio perhaps, to force Mr. Borgin to drink the poison, and then fled through the fireplace. Representatives from the Flu Network Administration at the Department of Magical Transportation denied that. "Of course, we checked the Flu Network's operational logs," one official said. Mr. Borgin's shop fireplace was not in use that entire morning. "Only a fool would believe the killer came through the fireplace," the official added. "It must be a curse that makes a person willingly take poison," said one Diagon Alley resident. "That old Borgin got what was coming to him. He must have done too many terrible things," said another from Nocturne Alley. This reporter will continue to follow the story. Scott closed the paper with a little shake of his head and set it aside. The Daily Prophet never failed to wander into spectacle. Serious reporting always seemed to slip into entertainment. Everyone becomes a Rita Skeeter in their pages, he thought. The new issue's front page crowed, "Rejoice! British Wizards! 1994 Quidditch World Cup host confirmed." The headline was jubilant, but unsurprising to Scott. He skimmed it and found the usual fulsome praise for the Ministry of Magic, and for Minister Fudge in particular. The rest of the paper was all Quidditch fever. Predictions that the national team would win, introductions to the confirmed venue, and hot takes on other nations' lineups. The excitement already read like the Cup was happening next week. Scott tossed the paper aside with a wry curl of his lip. "Scott!" Lambo called, swooping down to land on the windowsill. "Latest news. Members of the Borgin family have surfaced." "Members?" Scott raised an eyebrow. "So there are more people with that name besides Mr. Borgin." "But don't worry," Lambo said. "These other Borgins aren't closely connected to Mr. Borgin himself. They seem embarrassed by Borgin and Burke's, think the shop brought shame on the family." 267. Casting the Fidelius Charm. When Lambo brought the news, Scott asked curiously, "Do you know how many people are left in the Boke family?" "We'll probably know for sure at Mr. Borgin's funeral," Lambo replied. "This is important," Scott said. "Send some of your smartest ravens to find out more." Lambo fluffed his wings proudly. "The ravens watching the Bokes are the oldest members of my flock. They're far smarter than ordinary ravens." "They found the Bokes' residence?" Scott asked, surprised. "The ravens followed the family members all the way back," Lambo said. "They probably had to transport a coffin. That sort of formality makes using the Flu Network or apparition inconvenient." Lambo hopped from the windowsill to Scott's shoulder. "Unfortunately, they still haven't located the Yaxley Manor, so the information is vague." Scott thought a moment and suggested, "There's a good opportunity coming up." "What is it?" Lambo asked. "Jack Yaxley won the All-England Wizard Dueling Championship," Scott said. "The Yaxleys will throw a grand banquet and invite many guests to build momentum for him." "So?" Lambo cocked his head. "Pure-blood families cling to old traditions to show their status," Scott continued. "Some even travel to banquets in flying carriages. If we learn the date of the banquet and watch for wizard carriages, we can follow the trail to the Yaxley Manor." "I see," Lambo nodded eagerly. "He won the title the day before yesterday, but pure-bloods are particular about these things. There will be invitations, RSVPs. Expect the banquet within a few days, Scott finished for him. He had briefly considered infiltrating the banquet himself, but he dismissed the idea. With his current power, that would be too risky and unnecessary. Better to wait until he understood the Yaxley's strength. He smiled and looked out over the vast forest. Vengeance could wait. Lambo immediately set his plan in motion. A large number of ravens poured out of the trees, and the woods fell quiet. Scott kept watch over his unfinished potion. Because he had to stir it every 3 hours, he had gone without sleep that night and managed to finish his summer homework as well. By the next morning, the ritual potion was finally complete, and Scott collapsed into sleep. As dusk approached, Lambo flew into the cottage and woke him. "Scott! Wake up! Wake up!" Scott opened his eyes slowly. "What is it, Lambo?" He sat up against the headboard. "New moon night." Lambo flapped back to the windowsill. "Don't forget." "I almost did." Scott threw off the blanket, padded barefoot to the doorway, and watched the sun sink on the horizon as a cool evening breeze ruffled his hair. He smiled at the raven. "Thanks, Lambo." "You're welcome," Lambo said, craning his neck. "I'm curious how you hide your house." "Wait and see." Scott ate quickly, then sat on the floor by the door, waiting for the new moon. Lambo hopped down and perched on the floor beside him. "By the way," Lambo said, "I didn't tell you, Borgin's funeral is in 3 days. His given name was Caractacus Borgin, though people called him Mr. Borgin." Scott hummed. He didn't much care about a dead man's given name. His mind was occupied with the process of casting the Fidelius charm. The sun had nearly set. He had to catch the brief moment when the new moon first appeared, thin and flickering. It's about to begin. When the last golden ray slipped below the horizon, Scott stood. He went back into the house, activated the severed arm bone, then picked up the ritual potion and his wand. "The new moon has appeared," Lambo cried. Scott stepped outside and lifted his head to the faint crescent on the horizon. He tilted his head back and drank the potion in one swallow. Immediately, he focused on harmonizing the potion's power with his own magic. His wand traced winding arcs through the air as he intoned a long, complicated, poetic incantation. Slowly, silvery moonlight seemed to cloak him, a thin, watery veil, the potion amplifying his power. He pictured the secret he intended to hide, the small wooden house behind him. As the incantation neared its end, he pointed his wand at his chest. A silver filament of light shot from the wand and connected with his heart. The veil of moonlight around him solidified, becoming clear and crystalline. Scott felt as if he were sealed within a large, transparent crystal. When the potion's power finally spent itself, the crystal around him shattered into motes of light and disappeared. "It's gone," Lambo squawked, flying up in excitement. "It's really gone." Scott drew a breath. The Fidelius charm hadn't been conceptually difficult, but the trick was matching the potion's surge to his own magic. Too much, and the spell would fail. His strong perception had let him succeed on the first try. He looked back. The little wooden house had indeed vanished. Beneath his feet lay an enormous empty bird's nest. Then, as if an invisible curtain had been drawn aside, the house abruptly reappeared in the air and settled back onto the nest. Scott was still standing at its doorway. "Come on up." He held out his hand. Lambo obediently landed on his arm. "Do you see it, my little wooden house?" Scott asked with a smile. "Oh, incredible, I can see it!" Lambo crowed, circling and flapping with delight. "This is marvelous." On the evening of June 22nd, Lambo carried Scott across the dark sea and set down on a towering coastal cliff on the Isle of Man, the island between England and Ireland. "I didn't expect there'd be wizards hiding out on this island," Scott said casually after they landed. "I always thought this was a British Crown dependency." He stood on the cliff, wind off the water brushing his face, and stared into the black ocean below. Crows cawed in the distance. Scott glanced back. "Have the crows arrived?" He activated the severed arm bone in his pocket and flicked his wand. Lambo, previously shrunk, returned to his normal size. Several crows glided through the night and landed nearby, cawing at Lambo. "This way, Scott," Lambo said. "They say the Yaxley family's castle is over there." The crows led, Lambo and Scott following. Scott touched his wand to his chest and cast a disillusionment charm. An icy, subtle veil slid over him, and he melted into the shadows. He would catch up. They moved slowly. The moonlight was weak, and using a light charm would have been conspicuous, so Scott kept to a cautious pace. Guided by the crows, it took some time, but eventually they crested a cliff overlooking a small castle set into the rocky bay below. The place was brightly lit and bustling. Although he couldn't hear anything from his perch, it was clearly lively inside. Scott checked his pocket watch and whispered, "The banquet must be almost over." The crows had found the Yaxley Castle by his directions. He and Lambo had only arrived after receiving the news, so the feast was naturally drawing to a close. Scott narrowed his eyes, pushing his magical senses to full strength, and edged toward the precipice above the castle. He stopped 1,000 meters out when he detected magical wards, powerful perimeter protections befitting a pure-blood family. Better to approach from below. He pulled a flying broom from his deformed lizard skin bag, mounted, and flew down the cliff. He'd come in person to observe closely rather than attempt a risky infiltration. At the base of the cliff, beside hidden reefs, he found a small dock where an old but ornate wooden sailboat was moored. A steep, rugged path climbed straight up to the castle's main gate. He didn't go up immediately. Instead, he left a listening bat on the rocks near the dock and rose again on his broom, circling the cliff before slipping into the shadow of a crevice above the landing. Lambo followed. Not long after, Scott watched several flying carriages lift off from the castle and streak into the night. Clearly, the banquet was dispersing. Scott and Lambo waited in silence. About 20 minutes later, a group of people descended the steep path to the dock, and their voices drifted upward. Listening closely, Scott relaxed slightly. Among them were two Yaxleys, Liam Yaxley, heir to the family, and Jack Yaxley, the newly crowned dueling champion, seeing off their guests. This was the opportunity Scott had hoped for. He could tell the departing guests weren't British by their accents, likely French, but he paid them little mind and watched instead as they boarded the sailboat. The two Yaxleys walked to the water to wave them off. With a flick of its sails, the boat accelerated and pulled away across the water. Scott's curiosity about the boat's propulsion had no time for answers now. He focused on the conversation below. "A job well done, Brother Liam," Jock said, respectful and eager. Liam replied with a hoarse, measured tone, "It's nothing. I only hope you can secure the Travers line. If you inherit it, we can make both Yaxley and Travers stronger." His cadence was flat and deliberately cold, but Jack seemed used to it. "I'll do my best, Brother Liam." They began to walk away from the dock, and Scott let his listening bat drift after them at a distance, neither too close nor too far. When they passed directly beneath the crevice where he hid, the bat slipped up the interior of Scott's robe and settled against his shoulder. Scott could now hear every word clearly. Liam's voice turned sour. Those competitors from the other families showed up at dinner. "What did you think of them, Jack?" "Don't worry, Brother Liam," Jack answered with easy confidence. "I'm the perfect match for Travers. Their portraits would choose me." Liam sneered. "As Father said, Travers needs someone who can confront a family directly, not a sapling that still needs cultivating." Jack fawned praise for their father as they walked on. In the dark above them, Scott smiled. He opened what looked like an ordinary matchbox in his hand. Inside, tiny winged insects, the melt-in-your-mouth flying midges he'd kept since Borgen's death, stirred and flew out under his control. They were his standard, silent weapons. The insects, almost invisible, darted down into the mouths of the two Yaxleys as they conversed. Their outer skins were paper-thin, like rice paper, and the moment they contacted saliva, the skins dissolved. Any transfiguration on them was disrupted, and the insects reverted to their original poisonous state. By the time the brothers realized what was happening, the deadly toxin had already dissolved in their mouths. "What?" Liam roared, pain and shock cracking his voice. "Brother," Jock choked a surprised cry that fizzled into nothing. Both of them collapsed to the ground. With a soft pop, a house elf materialized nearby, shrieking as it scrambled to drag the fallen brothers out of harm's way. Another pop brought a white-haired old wizard into existence. The old man's eyes snapped toward the rock crevice, and he raised his wand without hesitation. Avada Kedavra! A green jet of light leapt toward the hiding place. Scott had no time to swing his wand. He clutched Lambo, hit the silver, snake-shaped necklace coiled on his wrist, and in an instant, both of them vanished without a trace. 2 and 69, the silent counterattack of a minor character. The world tilted, time and space folded. At the crucial moment, Scott activated the port key and blinked back to the Raven territory in the Scottish Highlands. He was dumped onto the forest floor, but this time his landing was better than the last two. He rolled and sat up instead of sprawling awkwardly among the leaves. Lambo had already scrambled out of his arms as soon as they hit, circling overhead and chittering excitedly. Oh my, it cried. Scott, that green light, was that the Avada Kedavra you told me about? Were we nearly dead just now? Pretty much, Scott said, still feeling the aftershocks of fear. He hadn't expected the Yaxley house elf and that old man to react so fast. He reached with his right hand to touch the silver, snake-shaped necklace coiled around his left wrist. If it hadn't been for that special port key, fast, untraceable, he probably would have. He might have died from that Avada Kedavra. And even if he dodged the curse, the fight afterward would have revealed his identity. Scott suspected the old wizard was the same man who had taken Professor Flitwick from the Forbidden Forest last time. Though not Flitwick's equal, the man had held him off long enough to prove he was dangerous. Scott might not be able to handle him. If Flitwick had decided to go all out, the current Scott definitely wouldn't have had the upper hand. And if he hadn't escaped with the port key, he'd have faced not only that old man, but the other Yaxleys as well. Adventuring had been an impulsive mistake, Scott thought inwardly. Lambo chimed in. Those two who swallowed the poison, they didn't look dead when the house elf dragged them off. Scott hesitated. I used a large dose this time. Logically, there shouldn't have been time to save them. But pure-blood families sometimes have resources we don't know about. They might. We'll have to wait for the raven we left there to send word, Lambo said. Scott breathed and stood slowly. Dead or alive, my plan worked, he said, smiling. Lambo, who already understood the scheme, answered, The Yaxleys will suspect the other two families competing with them for Travers, the Bulstrodes and the Foleys. Scott grinned and took off on his flying broom, climbing above the treetops. Lambo, worried it wouldn't fit inside the hidden house, clung to the broom's handle. As if a curtain had been drawn aside, a small wooden house built on a huge nest appeared. Lambo chirped twice and darted inside. Scott landed on the entrance floor, brought the broom in, pushed the door open, and flipped on the electric light. He filled the rooftop water tank, showered quickly, and then sat on the bed, replaying the last few days in his head. Lambo, though a raven, had the intelligence of a human child and couldn't follow every nuance. After the two young Yaxleys had been poisoned tonight, the Yaxley family would indeed suspect the Bulstrodes and the Foleys, but they wouldn't be certain. Scott figured they would soon notice the victim's symptoms matched Mr. Borgen's death 2 days ago, and the poison itself was the same. That could either distract the Yaxleys or make them more convinced of the Bulstrodes or Foley's guilt. It depended on how the family interpreted the evidence. Scott hoped they would remember that Travers, who had died suddenly in prison, had also died the same way. If no one recalled it, he would make sure they did. When something mysterious happens and no culprit is obvious, people look at who stands to benefit. The beneficiary is often the perpetrator. From the Yaxleys' point of view, the biggest winners after Travers' sudden death were the Bulstrodes and the Foleys. The Yaxleys had already reached an agreement with the late Travers. They only needed to eliminate Scott Trollope to gain Travers' authorization to control the family's assets. The Yaxleys probably believed the Travers estate was theirs for the taking. Although their first attempt against Scott had failed and had cost Brandon Yaxley his life, Scott could easily imagine how the arrogant family would explain it away. They'd call it Brandon's bad luck, caught by Dumbledore, running into a bizarre force like Medea Slytherin. In their eyes, killing a young Muggle-born like Scott would be trivial. What they wouldn't expect was that this seemingly insignificant young man could, with a single move, pull what they thought was within their grasp back out of reach and summon two powerful rivals in the process. By now, the Yaxleys had probably dismissed Scott as an unimportant minor character. But the one who'd escaped the vortex wasn't content to be ignored. Escaping and protecting himself wasn't enough. He intended to make anyone who actively threatened him pay first. Scott, what are you thinking about? Lambo perched on the bedside table, curious. Scott returned to the present and smiled slowly. He ran his hand through his wet hair, slicking it back, and a sharpness flashed behind his relaxed expression. They always say a triangle is the most stable shape, he murmured. Not only will the Yaxleys see themselves as victims, but the Bulstrodes and the Foleys are rivals who will suspect each other. He rose, poured a glass of water, and drank it down. That way, they'll get further and further from the truth. He sighed contentedly. Heh, this is exactly what I wanted. He yawned and lay back down. Let them fight it out. I can't interfere for a while. No matter how careful I am, I'd still leave clues. June 23rd, early morning. Scott woke up and felt too lazy to move. He propped himself against the headboard and turned to the window, watching the weak morning light and listening to birdsong from the trees. It wasn't pleasant bird music, harsh and discordant. Of course, the little house was ringed by hundreds, maybe thousands of crows. After a while, the cawing stopped. Wings beat the air in a dense flutter, then scattered. Scott! Lambo flew through the open window and landed on the bedside table, black feathers gleaming in the light, the dark patterning along his wings catching iridescent highlights. Several crows returned from the Isle of Man in London with news from Yaxley Castle and St. Mungo's, he said. Seems our conversation woke you. Sorry, I can't go beyond the eaves and the crows can't see me, so I have to shout to them from a distance. How are they? Scott asked, turning away from the window. One dead, one alive, Lambo answered. Scott smiled faintly. So our newly crowned dueling champion, Jack Yaxley, is dead? That's right. How did Liam survive? Can St. Mungo's neutralize ricin that fast? The father gave the older son a potion, and a healer at St. Mungo's finished saving him. The younger never drank it. He was dead on arrival. A life-saving potion the Yaxleys treasure, and only one vial, Scott guessed. He knew well that poisons Muggles called incurable were rarely truly incurable in the wizarding world, but saving someone from a fast-acting toxin still required skill and timing. And luckily, Snape hadn't been there last night. If he had, Scott's plans might have been ruined. Keep the crows watching, Scott told him. Watch the Yaxleys' reactions. Crows made excellent informants. Ordinary wizards without magic had no natural defense against them, and protective enchantments rarely targeted such birds, so they came and went freely through wizarding domains. I've already told them, Lambo said, a touch smug. Scott added, and don't let too many crows appear together. He didn't want a pattern. If crows showed up at every strange incident, people would notice. He was known for using crows. He even favored them when casting avifors. Eventually, the association could become obvious. My crows know how to act natural. Lambo bristled. That's good. Scott got out of bed and started making breakfast. One more thing, Lambo reminded him. Today's Borgin's funeral. Scott froze. He felt a pull to go, to see for himself whether the rest of the Boak family truly kept their distance from Borgin. A funeral would be easy to slip into. Borgin of Nocturne Alley had dealings with all kinds of unsavory characters. But the near-death experience on the Isle of Man had made Scott less inclined to take risks. I'll have to ask you to go for me, then, he said. Lambo belonged to him by transfiguration. Scott had created him, so he rarely refused requests. He grumbled a little, then set off to attend the funeral. Left alone in the little wooden house, hidden under a Fidelius charm, Scott spent the day with the Marauder's map in his hands. He muttered commands, tried known phrases and unrelated ones, attempted to probe the map's enchantments to read the concealed magic, but nothing worked. After a whole day of fruitless effort, he had to admit he'd wasted his time. At least the map was safe. He soothed himself with excuses about timing and opportunity and tucked it away in the house where the Fidelius charm made it safer than even his lizard skin bag. That reminded him. Fletch's lizard skin bag, taken from the dead thief, was still unopened. Now that Fletch was gone, Scott could risk opening it. He hesitated, untying it with care. Then he used a small item to block any trace or ownership enchantments that might be attached to the bag, and warded the floor. He sat cross-legged, cast a shield charm in front of himself, and then loosened the drawstring. He poured the bag's contents onto the floor and quickly flung the empty bag away. His caution paid off. The moment the contents spilled out, several enchanted items activated and launched magical attacks. Different colors of energy burst out, scattering through the house like a hurricane. Scott's wards held, the shield charm and his protective sigils kept him safe. He grabbed a long branch, pushed aside the debris, and began to sort through the fallen items. All the self-attacking trinkets shattered on activation, leaving wreckage across the floor. Scott gathered Fletch's coins first, just over 200 galleons, more than 100 sickles, and over 100 nuts. The haul satisfied him. Fletch had been a profitable thief and underground merchant. He piled the coins aside and began carefully cataloging the rest of the items, one by one. 271. The Ministry of Magic also joined in. Before Lambo returned, Scott had already sorted everything from Fletch's leather satchel. Inside were a handful of shabby magical items, a pile of odd materials, and several objects whose purpose he couldn't identify. Except for the raw materials, most of the things looked old, and many were damaged, clearly of uncertain origin. After organizing them into categories, Scott waved his wand and repaired the broken floorboards and the battered furniture in the hut. Lambo arrived back in the forest before Scott finished dinner. It couldn't get into the house hidden by the Fidelius charm, so it hovered in the treetops and called until Scott flew out on his broom to fetch it. While Scott ate, Lambo relayed the details of Mr. Borgen's funeral. The first half had been bleak. Aside from the Borgen family, expressionless and unsurprised, there were very few other mourners. Lambo mimicked the family's tone perfectly. The Borgen family does not welcome those undignified guests, it cawed. Uncle Kurtakis handles most of the wizards who wallow in the mud, but he can only represent himself. I do not wish for him to be buried as Mr. Borgen of Nocturne Alley. When he goes to meet death, he should be Caractacus Borgen of the Borgen family. Those fellows who hide in dark corners will not show up rashly. In short, the family had kept out many of the wizards who might normally attend, and only admitted certain pure-blood acquaintances. Scott admitted aloud that he had misjudged things. Even if he disguised himself as a dark wizard from Nocturne Alley, he wouldn't have been allowed into the service. Lambo brightened. But the second half, after the burial, was something else. Once the other guests had left, the Borgen family nearly came to blows. Scott wiped his mouth and immediately guessed the cause. They were fighting over Mr. Borgen's estate, he said. Exactly, Lambo answered. Although they all look down on Mr. Borgen's dark arts shop, they all want it. Lambo couldn't quite understand the complicated motives of the Borgens. Scott explained why inheriting a Nocturne Alley shop wasn't as simple as taking over a building. Entering a dark arts establishment without the owner's permission is perilous. To take it intact, a would-be heir would need to hire a specialist. Besides, in the days since Mr. Borgen's death, thieves and opportunists had likely already been there more than once. Even if the Borgen family managed to wrest control of the shop, that wouldn't amount to inheriting Mr. Borgen's real legacy. For a business in Nocturne Alley, the inventory was almost secondary to the channels of trade and the network of contacts the owner controlled. Semi-underground enterprises survive by knowing the rules of the trade and by holding access to useful resources. Without those, you can't keep a dark arts shop running for long. Lambo squawked in puzzlement. Why are you so sure the Borgens can't inherit it properly? Scott shook his head. They were foolish enough to exclude Mr. Borgen's old acquaintances from the funeral. By doing that, they've discarded the network they would need to run the place. He was sure that, at the end of any squabbling, the family would at best walk away with a few items. The shop itself would be unable to continue in its former capacity. Catching himself lecturing a raven about the nuances of Transfiguration and underground marketplaces felt faintly ridiculous, so Scott let the subject drop. For the next 2 days, he stayed in the hut, quietly studying Transfiguration and making no moves. The ravens kept him supplied with news. Word had spread through the British magical community that the Yaxley brothers had been attacked at their doorstep, and that Jack Yaxley, recently crowned dueling champion, had died. Scott suspected the Yaxleys would have preferred to keep the matter quiet, but the incident was too strange to be ignored. As always, Rita Skeeter had found the story irresistible. The persistent reporter, who seemed to court scandal as a pastime, had produced a flurry of sensational articles. She speculated wildly: revenge, love triangles, fratricide. She tied the Yaxley poisoning to Mr. Borgin's death and, with increasingly baroque connections, dragged the Travers deaths into the same narrative. By the end, she was suggesting a half-year-long conspiracy aimed at seizing the Travers family's wealth, implicating the Bulstrodes or the Foleys as masterminds. Scott read her pieces like a serialized novel and was secretly glad for the timing. Rita's spectacular imagination had, unintentionally, helped shift suspicion about Jasmine Travers' death away from the truth he was guarding. He wasn't grateful to her, though. He only muttered, a wry edge to his voice, "The Travers inheritance must be irresistible. Now the Ministry of Magic has joined in. Perhaps they're short on funds for next year's Quidditch World Cup." 272. More excitement than expected. In Scott's view, Rita Skeeter was plainly a pro-ministry reporter. Her track record made it obvious: the woman who wrote with such abandon, daring to name names and never seeming to fear offense, hardly ever published pieces that truly attacked the ministry. When she did, her criticisms were shallow, nothing like the sharpness she showed on other subjects. With that in mind, the real reason she had spent the last 2 days obsessively covering the Travers inheritance affair was suddenly very interesting. The struggle over the Travers inheritance among the Yaxley, Bulstrode, and Foley families had always been conducted in private and ignored by the press. But it wasn't a secret. Any witch or wizard with connections would know this was the headline event in the British magical world right now. The Traverses were one of the so-called Sacred 28, families that, according to Cantankerous Knots, the Pureblood Directory, maintained true pureblood status into the 1930s. Whether or not people agreed with Knott's strictures, being listed in that book meant a family had a long history and valuable hereditary magical resources, techniques, traditions, and powerful artifacts. Scott knew part of the Travers inheritance firsthand. He had the severed arm bone, an item that could sever contracts, and he had the cursed device Jasmine Travers had used before she died. According to her, if Scott had admitted to killing her, that curse would have taken effect and killed him. Both objects were dangerous in their own right. Beyond artifacts, these old families passed down techniques, Ollivander wandcraft being the most famous example, but others carried distinct skills too. Scott suspected the Weasleys knew a unique approach to making and modifying magical objects, something that explained how Fred and George produced their extraordinary joke items despite their less-than-studious school records. Arthur Weasley's flying car, beyond its functionality, seemed to possess a kind of simple self-awareness, astonishing in itself. Professor Flitwick had once given Scott a sketch of some traditional family strengths: the House of Black's relatively straightforward animagus techniques, the Slughorn knack for picking out promising young talent, the Greengrass's secretive bloodline research, the Knott's authority in British magical history. Many pureblood houses were also practiced in the dark arts and kept their legacies closely guarded for that reason. Because the Yaxleys had recently been making moves regarding the Travers estate, Scott had his crows watching them and had learned more than he'd expected about the Traverses' inheritance. Their signature wasn't just artifacts, it was a subtle mind-binding magic, the sort that altered people without leaving the obvious marks of Imperius. Victims of it really believed in the caster. They willingly sacrificed everything for them. That explained how Jasmine Travers had rallied a whole circle of girls to her side and why some still missed her. For someone of Jasmine's age to have reached such a level was terrifying. The magic could be countered, occlumency could block it, but the threat lay in how invisible and insidious it could be. A series of crow calls snapped Scott back from his thoughts. He glanced at the black birds flitting among the courtyard hedges and then at the latest issue of the Prophet. Rita's articles were classic Skeeter, sensational, exaggerated, but her aim was clear. Her innuendos about the Bulstrode and Foley families were perfectly timed. With Joqua Yaxley dead, the Yaxleys could no longer put forward a new Travers claimant. If the Bulstrodes and Foleys were publicly discredited, the ministry would have grounds to bar them from the inheritance. With no legitimate blood heir left, the Travers estate could then be declared crown, or more precisely, fall under the control of the Ministry of Magic as an institution. And by ministry, Scott didn't mean only Minister Fudge. He meant a whole network of interests, senior officials, allied pure-blood families, and others who stood to gain by keeping rival claimants out of the running. "This is perfect," he murmured, excitement brightening his eyes. As an obscure instigator, Scott hadn't imagined things would spin out this vividly. It was far more entertaining than he'd planned. Worried that overreaching might expose him, he had originally planned an early return to Madrid, but now he didn't want to leave Britain. He wanted to watch the spectacle unfold, and he secretly hoped some of the players would do each other serious harm. 273. Scott's happiness. Although Scott really wanted to stay in Britain to witness the grand spectacle, he ultimately changed his mind. On the afternoon of June 25th, he went to Calendar as usual to call his parents. Hearing Michael and Amelia on the phone, he could sense their worry, thinly veiled though it was, and he quickly changed his plans. He spent one night teaching Lambo how to use a mobile phone, instructing it to fly to a town with a signal every day to call him after he left. He officially named his little wooden house Oak Cottage and wrote its location on a note, which he gave to Lambo. With that note, Lambo would remember the secret of Oak Cottage when it saw it, making it easy for the creature to enter the house to charge the phone. After setting everything up, Scott headed to London Heathrow on June 27th and took an afternoon flight to Madrid Barajas. Only Ramiro came to pick him up this time. "Scott!" Ramiro greeted him with an enthusiastic bear hug the moment they met. "My brother, did your magical adventure go smoothly?" he shouted, his excitement like that of a schoolboy. People nearby glanced over, attracted by Ramiro's exuberance. Scott tried to free himself from the hug, but Ramiro's grip was too strong. He answered flatly, "Thanks, everything went fine. You have to tell me all about it later." Ramiro finally let go and patted his shoulder. He still looked intensely interested in the wizarding world. Scott nodded, and they headed to the car together, but he didn't plan to reveal much. On the drive back, he answered a few of Ramiro's questions, simplifying his experiences and making them sound as dull as possible. "Oh, Scott, are you worried about me?" Ramiro asked suddenly, as if he had read Scott's thoughts. Before Scott could reply, he continued in his accented English. "I know. You're afraid I'm too interested in magic, and that isn't good for me," he shrugged. "Because I'm a muggle, in the wizard's words?" Scott stayed silent. That was exactly his concern. He hadn't been sure how deep Ramiro's interest in magic went. Was it just curiosity, like enjoying a novel or movie, or did he long to be part of it? Scott remembered Ramiro had even asked if he could go with him when he left. He worried that Ramiro might become obsessed, even develop the idea of wanting to become a wizard. Muggles don't become wizards. There was no known case. If Ramiro entertained that thought, it would only cause him pain. The more you crave something that can never be yours, the more it hurts. Just like Petunia, Harry's aunt in the original stories Scott had read. Scott thought it best not to tell Ramiro too much at first, to dampen his enthusiasm. He hadn't expected Ramiro to be so perceptive. After he said that, Ramiro focused on driving and the car fell into an awkward silence. Scott was about to speak when Ramiro suddenly burst into laughter, leaning back and forth so much Scott feared he'd swerve. "Ha ha ha!" He laughed for a long time, then stopped. "You're too serious, Scott." Ramiro raised an eyebrow. "Don't worry, I've been a muggle for 19 years. I'm used to it. I'm not that jealous." Scott gritted his teeth inwardly. "Are you teasing me?" "Sorry." Ramiro offered a mock apology with no real remorse. "If it were Dad, would you worry about him the same way?" "Of course not," Scott said. "Uncle Caleb is mature and rational." Ramiro tossed his perfectly styled hair, clearly the work of half a bottle of hairspray, with an air of smugness. "Your cousin Ramiro is mature and rational too, at least more so than you. Your worries are unnecessary." "I'm just curious about the unknown," he said. "It's like reading a book or watching a film. I don't actually want to get involved." He laughed. "But if I could visit the wonders of the so-called magic world, I wouldn't mind that." Scott smiled helplessly. If Ramiro weren't family, he wouldn't be as worried. He wouldn't care if someone else suffered over an impossible desire. After another laugh, Ramiro changed the subject. "Oh, by the way, Irene's sister, Benita, I think. Saw me at a party a few days ago and asked about you. Scott hummed noncommittally. I told her you went back to Britain. Ramiro patted his shoulder in reassurance. You don't seem very interested in her anymore. No problem. The summer's long. I can throw a few more parties. Madrid has plenty of beautiful girls. Forget it, Scott said. He wasn't interested in parties. If I wanted a girlfriend, I'd find a witch at Hogwarts. At least then, we could see each other every day. Ramiro disagreed. You could wait for school, sure, but that doesn't mean you can't enjoy the summer with girls in Madrid first. What a playboy line. Scott simply shook his head. He was busy. Besides continuing his magic research, he still truly cared about his compatriots back in Britain's magical community, especially the brewing dispute over Travers's inheritance. He didn't want to miss a single twist of that war, and was ready to be the quiet hand that nudged things from the shadows again. With Lambo in Britain and his ability to control things remotely, he could still influence many events. That thought made him genuinely happy. This was Scott's happiness. Tour 74, New School Year, the start of 5th year, September 1st, 1993, King's Cross Station, London. Scott, who had turned 15 over the summer, pushed his luggage trolley into the station with his 3 roommates. Since Roger, Milton, and Eddie were already in London, Scott had arranged by phone to meet them at the station before term started. How was your summer in London all on your own? Scott asked Milton, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 months. It was great, Milton replied. I went all over London and got a much better sense of Muggle life. Roger grinned. Milton even joined his community band and became the most popular musician in the neighborhood. Milton gave a shy smile. Compared to how troubled he'd been at the end of last term over family problems, he looked a lot happier. It seemed his summer had done him good. You still don't know, Eddie cut in excitedly, but I went to the United States for the summer. Scott chuckled. Did you save the best bit for the start of term? Eddie beamed and launched into a breathless account of his trip. Unfortunately, he'd gone with Mr. Carmichael on a business visit and hadn't seen any of the American wizarding schools. Scott and the others tried to listen politely, but their interest quickly waned. Milton leaned in quietly and asked Scott, Did you only get back to Britain today? No, yesterday, Scott said. I went down to Diagon Alley yesterday to buy new textbooks. Roger joined in. I still don't know who the school hired as the new Care of Magical Creatures professor, but that textbook that bites people at random is just bizarre. You can tell from the style of books he chose, Scott replied with a smile. They ran for platform 9 3/4 together. Eddie trailed off about his American trip and fell silent. Even after they were settled in their compartment, Eddie kept shooting them glances that were half sulk, half resentment. Scott ignored him and kept the conversation rolling on other topics. When the train moved, Eddie couldn't hold out forever and rejoined the chat. At that moment, Scott stood and clipped a blue and gold badge onto his robe. Oh, a prefect badge? Roger teased. I knew it. New male prefect for 5th year's got to be you. Congrats, Scott, Milton added. Next year it'll be me. Eddie protested, not entirely convincingly. Scott nodded. I should go to the prefect carriage. He left the compartment, walked through several carriages, and climbed into the prefect carriage behind the engine, where the head boy and girl and several other prefects were already gathered. Scott made his way to the Ravenclaw side and greeted familiar faces. See? I told you you'd be a prefect, Scott, Penelope said warmly. Thanks, Scott replied politely. It's your 5th year's turn to guide the new students this year, Ethan Cooper said, clapping Scott on the shoulder. Let's hope you don't have the kind of trouble we did last year. Scott knew exactly what Ethan meant. Caitlin Roll's staged fall down the spiral staircase to frame Jacob. I was terrified when that girl went down, he admitted. Eva Taylor, another prefect his year, shuddered. Lucky Ethan cast a spell in time to save her. Kayla, a girl in Scott's year who'd just been announced as a female prefect, came running into the carriage and sat next to him, still breathless. Scott noticed she kept glancing at him. What's up, Kayla? He asked. Regretting Professor Flitwick didn't pick Dylan as the male prefect? Are you kidding? Kayla scoffed. Dylan and I would not want to be stuck together all the time. Not long after, all the prefects had assembled. The 2 7th-year head prefects stood and spoke briefly to welcome the new prefects and remind everyone to patrol the carriages and look after the new students from each house. After the briefing, Scott and Kayla set off on their patrol. Despite her protest, Dylan managed to stick to them almost immediately. Scott clapped Dylan on the shoulder and handed over a section of the carriages to him. Dylan accepted the duty with obvious pleasure. Scott, in a good mood, walked lightly back to his original compartment. On the way, he passed the compartment where the famous trio sat. Harry was waving his hands and talking animatedly to Ron and Hermione. He looked absolutely thrilled. Scott knocked and pushed the door open. "Hello." Harry froze mid-gesture but broke into an awkward smile. "Congratulations about your godfather, Mr. Black. I read the Daily Prophet over the summer." Harry turned to Scott and smiled a little more genuinely. "Thanks, Scott. I haven't had the chance to say thank you yet. You were the first to notice Scabbers was acting strangely, weren't you? If it hadn't been for you, Sirius might not have been found." "You're welcome," Scott said, leaning in the doorway. "It was mostly a coincidence." He glanced at Ron. It did result in Ron losing his beloved pet. "Ugh!" Ron's face twisted as though he'd been poked. "Don't say that!" Hermione covered her mouth to hide her laugh. Losing Scabbers turned out okay for Ron. Mr. Weasley won the Daily Prophet's Reader Prize, and Ron's family managed to get a new pet. Ron nodded, looking a bit rueful. "Scabbers, Pettigrew must have been a bad luck rat." Harry added, "Sirius wants to thank you properly." "He'll have the chance soon," Harry said, giving Scott a conspiratorial wink. Scott watched Harry's lips and the eager look on his face and couldn't help piecing things together. "Mr. Black will be the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor?" he guessed. Harry's eyes widened. "How did you know?" he blurted. Scott smiled inwardly. This year had already jumped straight into the kinds of surprises that made fifth year interesting. 275. The excitement at the start of school dinner. The Great Hall was bright with countless candles floating overhead, their flames reflected in the polished wood and the faces of the students. The sorting ceremony had just ended, and unlike other years, the older students had given the new first years only a polite, perfunctory applause. Most of the room's attention was already fixed on the figure striding toward the staff table. Everyone recognized him. After months of sensational headlines in the Daily Prophet and the long shadow of his story, the man who had been unjustly imprisoned in Azkaban for 12 years was now a household name across the British wizarding world. Sirius Black. Scott, sitting at the Ravenclaw table, turned to watch the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor approach. Black wore a new robe that caught the candlelight with glints of silver. His shoulder-length black hair had been carefully arranged, and even the mustache above his lip was neatly trimmed. Compared to the haggard photos from 2 months ago, he looked fit and spirited, wearing a confident, almost flamboyant smile. Apart from slightly sunken cheeks, no one would have guessed he'd endured a dozen years of Azkaban. Under 100 curious eyes, Black calmly took his place at the professor's table. He bowed gracefully to Dumbledore and the other staff, then sat beside Professor McGonagall. "That's Black," the students began to murmur at once. "I didn't expect to see him at Hogwarts." "He's our new professor? What does he teach?" "Defense Against the Dark Arts, obviously." "Do you think he can finally break the curse on that post?" "Everyone's calling him a hero. Maybe he can." The chatter showed how interested everyone was in the man with such a remarkable past. Just then, Professor Snape arrived late from the opposite end of the hall. His wide black robes billowed as he moved, like a storm cloud crossing the light. Black's expression hardened the moment he saw him, pure disdain. Snape, with the faintly raised chin he often wore, nodded slightly to a few colleagues and deliberately ignored Black, taking a seat near Professor Flitwick. For reasons Scott couldn't see, Black muttered something to Hagrid on his other side. McGonagall and even Dumbledore looked a little uncomfortable. "Look at Snape," Eddie whispered. The potions master's face was severe. Even though Flitwick, Dumbledore, and McGonagall were between him and Black, Snape slid his chair closer to Professor Sprout, as if distancing himself from a contagion. "Oh, they're definitely enemies," Eddie added in a low, thrilled tone. "Probably the kind who secretly hope the other drops dead." "We can all see that," Roger said with a grin. Milton sighed. "Gryffindor and Slytherin, Old rivalries. Silence, please. Professor McGonagall tapped her cup with her wand to get everyone's attention. Dumbledore rose to his feet with a welcoming smile. Welcome back to Hogwarts, everyone. He swept his eyes across the hall. First, a warm welcome to our new students. He led the applause, and the hall answered enthusiastically. The first years blushed with excitement. Dumbledore quieted the room with a raised hand and continued, "Next, I should like to formally introduce 2 new members of our staff." He looked at Hagrid. Rubus Hagrid, our keeper of keys and grounds, has kindly agreed to take on the post of care of magical creatures professor this year. Applause broke out. Some Gryffindors even cheered. The Slytherin table was noticeably subdued. Hagrid stood, wobbled trying to bow, and in his effort, his huge frame nearly toppled the long table. McGonagall's wand flashed to steady the tumbling goblets, and Hagrid sat back down, cheeks reddening at the laughter from the Slytherins. Dumbledore didn't seem to mind the interruption. With a twinkle in his eye, he went on, "And now, please welcome our new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Professor Sirius Black." This time, the applause was wholehearted. "That's my godfather!" Scott heard Harry shout from the Gryffindor table, and a ripple of excitement passed around the hall. The Slytherin applauses, however, grew thin and then stopped altogether, an audible fissure in what had been a roomful of welcome. Only Snape remained unmoved. Flitwick and Sprout exchanged more than one worried glance at him, but he paid them no mind. He sat with a glass in hand, staring at the wine as if it were a potion under study, indifferent to the cheers. The sudden coldness from him put a brief damper on the mood. Even some students who had been clapping fell quiet. At the staff table, Black leaned forward and shot a hard look at the 3 professors in the middle, his gaze locking on Snape. Snape sipped his wine and, with barely concealed satisfaction, smiled faintly. Dumbledore cleared his throat before any argument could flare, and smiling benevolently, waved his wand. "Now, let us enjoy the feast." At once, platters of savory and sweet food appeared on the long tables, and the hall burst into cheers. Attention returned to the generous spread, and the tension between Black and Snape faded from most minds. Scott turned back to his own plate. "Hogwarts is going to be lively this year, isn't it?" he said to his roommates. "Oh, I'm already looking forward to it," Eddie replied, grinning with a mouthful of roast. Milton added, "Might have a professor whose hobby is deducting points from Slytherin." "Let Black and Snape go at each other," Roger said with obvious relish. "Let them take points off Slytherin and Gryffindor. Then we Ravenclaws can win the House Cup again." 276. Scott's welcome work. After the feast came the usual school song. Dumbledore waved his wand like a baton, conducting the students with gusto. "Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hogwarts, please teach us knowledge, whether we are bald old men or children with scraped knees." Scott listened to the chaotic chorus, opening and closing his mouth in sympathy. Dumbledore already knows the proper tune for the school song. Why doesn't he just make everyone sing it right? Milton complained with a frown. "Maybe the headmaster prefers his students to have a little freedom," Scott answered casually. When the song finished, the students turned and began to file out of the great hall. Scott's roommates patted him on the shoulder and headed out first. A piece of parchment floated over from the teacher's table and stopped in front of Scott. He reached out, took it, and saw that it listed the names of the first-year Ravenclaws. He caught Professor Flitwick's eye, gave a smile, then waved to Kyla and stood up to clap, drawing the attention of the still bewildered first years. "First years," he called loudly. "Look here." Kyla stepped up beside him. "First years, please follow us." They walked to the end of the long table, and the first years fell in behind. Scott scanned the small group quickly, then began to lead them out of the hall. "My name is Scott Trollope, and this is Kyla White," he announced. "We're the fifth-year prefects of Ravenclaw," Kyla continued. "By tradition, the 2 of us will lead you back to the Ravenclaw common room." A few bolder first years started to say their names, but Scott and Kyla ignored them. Kyla smiled at the youngsters. "You don't need to introduce yourselves to us, and we're not going to make a special effort to remember your names." She paused and let the silence hang for a moment. "There are only 2 ways we'll remember you. One is by making mistakes and causing us trouble, and the other is by being so outstanding that we can't help but notice you." Scott added with a grin. You'll find out which way soon enough. I hope you'll be the latter. They walked on, heads high, and the first years, shaking off their shock, hurried to keep up. This is the most exciting moment since I became a prefect, Kyla murmured to Scott. I've wanted to say that to the first years for ages, she admitted. When I said it, I was dead nervous. Scott nodded. It was a bit of mischief Ravenclaw seniors enjoyed passing down. To accommodate the little legs behind them, they deliberately slowed their pace. Scott glanced back. Smart Ravenclaws should remember this route instinctively by now, so they won't be late tomorrow because they got lost, he said. He watched the first year's expressions change. A few of the smaller ones had already started memorizing the way. They wound through corridors, took several turns, and finally reached the base of Ravenclaw Tower on the west side of the castle. This is Ravenclaw Tower, Kyla told them. Ravenclaw's element is air, so our common room and dormitories are at the top of the tower. She led them inside and up the spiral staircase. Be careful, she warned. Last year a girl fell on the stairs at the beginning of term. Scott stayed at the back to make sure no one tripped. He waved his wand with mock solemnity. Don't worry, even if you fall, I will catch you. The reassurance didn't do much for the nerves of the first years. They looked even more anxious. Fortunately, no one tumbled this year. They reached the common room entrance without incident. Scott demonstrated the bronze eagle-shaped knocker and how to answer its question. It asked, will liars be honest after they die? No, they won't. They lie still after they die. Scott answered along with Kyla, and the door swung open. Inside, the two prefects faced the first years for the last time. Congratulations on becoming members of Ravenclaw, Kyla said. We hope that in the coming years, your performance will earn you recognition from the rest of the house. In this house, that's how your name becomes known, Scott added. Now we'll take you separately to your boys' and girls' dormitories. Scott shepherded the boys to the entrance to their dormitory, then returned to his own sleeping quarters. Hey, Scott, Eddie called as soon as he saw him. What were the first years like when you said that this year? They were terrified and stunned, Scott shrugged. Exactly like you were. Roger burst out laughing. Eddie was worse, though. Remember when he was sorted into a dorm with 3 second years? He stood in the center of the room and in exaggerated tones mimicked Eddie's first entrance. Hello, I'm Eddie Carmichael. I'm new this year, and because there weren't enough rooms, I was put here. The impression was uncannily vivid. Eddie ground his teeth and lunged at Roger, who dodged and laughed. Scott passed between them with his laundry basket and went to the bathrooms for a shower. On his return, he flopped onto his bed and stared at his new timetable. Tomorrow's Thursday, Milton noted. Defense against the dark arts is in the afternoon. I wonder what Professor Black is like as a teacher. It'll be better than Professor Quirrell or Lockhart, Scott said. Too bad we're in class with Hufflepuff, Eddie said regretfully. We won't get to see Black take points from Slytherin. Are you sure Black will be anything like Snape? Scott asked with a smile. He'll definitely go head-to-head with Snape, Roger said confidently. Scott had his own thoughts. Black's personality seemed nothing like Lupin's from the original stories. He was showy, not patient. Scott had a feeling that he and Snape might come to blows someday. 277. Eavesdropping, development, letters. I can't believe Millicent missed the start of term, one Slytherin muttered. You didn't know? The Bosted family's in trouble. In trouble again? Still about the Travers inheritance? That's right. Millicent's father was attacked. He's in St. Mungo's for magical maladies and injuries. Nobody knows if he'll pull through. My dad says it was either a Yaxley or a Foley. Scott sat at the Ravenclaw table, eating slowly and listening to the whispers from a cluster of third-year Slytherins. He'd been up before everyone else and had hung a listening bat beneath the Slytherin long table. The boys' conversation revolved around Malfoy and his 2 hulking bodyguards, Crabbe and Goyle, and his admirer Parkinson. The subject was their classmate Millicent Bulstrode. Scott remembered Millicent as an imposing, hawk-faced girl. Her looks weren't the point. Her name was Bulstrode. Yaxley, Bosted, Foley. 3 pure-blood houses locked in a fight over the Travers inheritance. Over the summer, the rivalry had gone from tense to bitter. stoked by quiet instigators until the dispute felt dangerously close to all-out war. The Yaxleys, who'd been shut out of the running, were furious, not least because they'd lost an excellent young wizard and had shifted from ambition to blind revenge against Bosted and Foley. Those two families, in turn, were enraged by Yaxley provocations. The feud had escalated into direct ambushes and attacks that the patriarch of the Bosteds lay in St. Mungo's made it clear the situation was spinning out of control. Scott had expected more mischief than mayhem. Aside from nudging the competition's start, he hadn't done much. Most of the summer he'd been in Spain, directing Lambo and a flock of crows by phone, so his influence had been limited. But he was sure the ministry and several pure-blood houses had poured oil on the flames. Lucius Malfoy, after all, was a shrewd operator, and the crows near the ministry had seen him enter and leave Cornelius Fudge's office often enough. It was hardly surprising Malfoy had played a part. The Yaxleys weren't fools either. Some within that house already suspected the Ministry of meddling. The old Yaxley, who had once nearly cast Avada Kedavra at Scott, was not a man to let perceived slights pass. Once the scale of the catastrophe was clear, none of the three families could step back gracefully. Everyone smelled opportunity, everyone smelled treachery, and events were slipping from anyone's control. "My dad thinks the ministry might try to take back the Travers estate," the young Malfoy was saying now, in that bored, show-off tone of his. After all, there aren't any true Travers left. His cronies nodded, and Parkinson cooed approval. Listening to them made Scott slightly queasy. "Good morning." Two loud voices broke through and scattered his thoughts. "Ravenclaw Prefect," Fred and George called as they burst through the Great Hall entrance. They flopped into the seats beside Scott and began piling food onto his place at the Ravenclaw table as if it were their own. "Esteemed Prefect," they said, chewing. "Why aren't you wearing your shiny badge?" Fred teased. "Look who it is," Scott shot back. "The two tycoons. Morning, Mr. Weasley." Fred's eyes widened as he got the joke. "You mean my dad winning the lottery?" "Unfortunately, no. We're still poor," George shrugged. "All the winnings went on a family trip to Egypt." "Egypt? Did you go traipsing around pyramids with Bill?" Scott asked, intrigued. He'd corresponded with Bill over the summer about combining Transfiguration with ancient runes and charms. Bill's experiences as a Gringotts cursebreaker had been a rare and valuable source of insight. "We wanted to," the twins said in unison, regretful. "Everyone else told us not to, except Bill." George fished a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "Bill sent this, said to give it to you." "Thanks," Scott said, taking it. "Bill's pretty upbeat about your research," Fred added. "He's impressed with how far you've come." "These are some of his new finds, from inside the pyramids," George added, trying to sound mysterious. Scott smiled at the thought. Bill's notes could be full of useful surprises. "Mom was amazed you two get to talk to Bill about magic," Fred said, mouthful. "She thinks you're brilliant. She told us to learn from you," George pouted. "She says we didn't get enough O's last year." "After hearing that, we're seriously considering whether we should even stay friends with you anymore." "Goodbye." Before Scott could reply, they snatched the bread from his plate, jumped up, and ran off, still cackling. 278, a generous gift from Bill after Transfiguration and History of Magic classes that morning. Scott waited until after lunch to get back to the dormitory before opening Bill's letter. The letter itself was only a single sheet of parchment. The rest of the thick packet was taken up with Bill's painstaking blueprints and a stack of photographs. Scott read the letter quickly. As a Gringotts cursebreaker, Bill worked closely with the goblins who ran the bank. Goblins, ever acquisitive, had a habit of turning up odd and dangerous magical objects. Bill's job was to remove the curses and study what lay beneath. Egypt, Bill explained, was especially rich in such finds. The ruins and pyramids on that land were far more numerous than Muggles knew. Many pyramids dated from an era when wizards and Muggles coexisted, and even served the same monarchs, which meant ancient wizards must have had a hand in their construction. Modern Egyptian wizards, it turned out, had discovered a great deal of preserved magic in those tombs, and the goblins were all too eager to get involved. Since goblins couldn't simply overrule the Egyptian Ministry of Magic, Gringotts had struck deals with the ministry for joint excavations and development. How the profits were split was a complicated matter Bill didn't need to explain at length. What mattered was that Bill, because of his work, had been able to explore pyramid ruins frequently and to study many newly unearthed artifacts. In his letter, he said that a recent joint excavation had yielded a lot of material, less in gold and more in knowledge. The blueprints Scott had been given were Bill's generous sharing: dissection diagrams of ancient magical mechanisms, transcriptions of Egyptian magical scripts from mural fragments, and even records and photographs of peculiar Egyptian creatures found in the tombs. Bill had annotated everything with his own notes. Scott flipped through the drawings with mounting excitement. They were meticulous. Bill had written observations and tentative theories in the margins. It was the sort of gift that only someone with Bill's access and goodwill could give. Scott knew he wouldn't have received such a present if he hadn't helped the Weasleys with the incidents involving Voldemort's diary and Peter Pettigrew. Short on time, he only skimmed the material, but he could feel how much it would mean to his studies. He gathered the sheets into a sturdy document satchel and slid it into his shape-shifting lizard skin bag, tucking it close to his body. Then he packed the textbooks and notes he'd need for Defense Against the Dark Arts and left the dormitory. The moment he stepped into the common room, Eddie's voice reached him first. "So if any of you need anything, you can come to me. Here, take a catalog." Eddie was surrounded by a few first years, passing out small booklets one by one. "Remember," he announced, conspiratorially, "my name's Eddie Carmichael, fourth-year Ravenclaw, Hogwarts' most reliable underground merchant." Scott slid his books under his arm and sidled up behind Eddie, plucking a booklet from his hand to look through. The first years, a little intimidated by Scott's presence, shuffled away. The booklet's cover carried only the Hogwarts crest, but inside it was crammed with useful, if dubious, content. A simple map of the castle highlighting routes between the house's common rooms, the Great Hall, and the main classrooms. A condensed school life guide with tips for newcomers, and then, appended as if it were business as usual, a product catalog. There were prank items invented by the Weasley twins, illicitly brewed potions that Eddie had concocted, and a selection of goods purportedly available in Hogsmeade. Scott's eyes drifted to the very last page. "What's this?" he said. Eddie peered over his shoulder as Scott read aloud, "Mysterious arithmancy. Arithmancy services provided by a genius diviner from Ravenclaw. Incredibly accurate. He used arithmancy to find the lost Ravenclaw diadem. 100% satisfaction. To book arithmancy, contact service agents Eddie Carmichael, Fred Weasley, George Weasley." Eddie beamed. "See, Fred and George and I put it together. Mostly my idea, of course." Scott felt his cheeks warm a little. He'd never intended to be advertised like a service. "That was your idea too?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Of course," Eddie craned his neck, fishing for praise. "Everything before that is good. This is the best bit." Scott handed the booklet back with a testy tone. "I don't think arithmancy should be advertised." Eddie's smile faltered. Scott lowered his voice. "I never meant to do divination for lots of people. And this turns it into a commodity. It destroys the mystery. Didn't I tell you not to make a business out of it?" "Don't worry," Eddie rushed to reassure him. "This is only an ad. It doesn't really involve you. We'll control it. We won't accept every request." "It's too late," Scott said. "Once it's printed, people will see it as something you can buy." Eddie rubbed his hands and offered a forced grin. "Isn't that okay? We make a bit of money. Everyone's happy." "You make a good point," Scott interrupted with a thin smile. "But I don't accept it. I'm canceling the arithmancy service." Eddie's face fell. "You can't do that, Scott. If you don't provide arithmancy, what will we do?" Scott's expression softened. "You're my friends. If you ever need me to help out for your friends, especially those old customers who've already spent a lot with you, maybe I'll soften." Eddie's eyes lit up at the possibility. "Good idea," he murmured. Scott patted him on the shoulder and turned toward the library, the booklet already forgotten in his hand. 279. Black's Teaching Experience. Scott found Helena in the Ravenclaw library, greeted her, and talked with her for a while. Over time, her transformation became even more complete. She was no longer cold and unapproachable. With others, her manner had softened, and she was friendlier. Since it was already Thursday, Scott and Helena agreed to meet the Ravenclaw portrait together on Saturday. The room of requirement had a peculiar structure, and as a ghost, Helena could not enter it alone. She could ask other students for help, of course, but she probably did not want to share her old study with too many people. After he said goodbye to Helena, Scott left Ravenclaw Tower and went to the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom early. Pushing open the door, he found Professor Black standing alone by the podium. "Professor Black," Scott greeted. "Hello, you must be Scott Trollope." Black broke into a smile at the sight of him, came forward, and extended his hand. "Last night at the feast I asked Professor McGonagall which one was you." Scott shook his hand. "I've been meaning to thank you in person. You were the one who noticed something was wrong with that rat, weren't you?" At the mention of Pettigrew, disgust washed over Black's face. "It's such a pity. Everyone was watching me. They stopped me from killing that rat." For a moment his emotions flared. Scott met his look with a mild, surprised expression, and Black immediately forced himself calm. "Oh, sorry." He drew a few deep breaths. "I got carried away." "It's all right. That person did something unforgivable," Scott said sympathetically. "I was there when Professor Snape made him take Veritaserum." Black's expression shifted again at Snape's name, but he quickly recovered and smiled. He patted Scott on the shoulder. "Anyway, thank you. You're a remarkable student. Harry's very grateful. He says you're a genius." Scott smiled back. "You're welcome. It was a bit of luck. I just have a knack for magic sensing and transfiguration." "Stronger than I was at your age," Black said. "You remind me of James." He fell briefly into a nostalgic look. James was excellent at transfiguration, too. Seeing the change in mood, Scott steered the conversation toward the Defense Against the Dark Arts course. Black was enthusiastic and confident, eager to get started. Students began filing into the classroom, so Scott wrapped up the conversation and took a seat among the pupils. As he talked with Black, he couldn't help noticing the old man's fragility. 12 years in Azkaban, living under the constant threat of Dementors, had left a mark. Although Black seemed composed, his emotions were a touch unstable, more liable to sudden swings than most people. That made him more likely to have outbursts. Still, compared with the array of tragic or incompetent predecessors, the Dark Lord's puppet or the charlatan who relied on memory charms, a professor like Black, flawed as he might be, was a marked improvement. For such a fraught post, one couldn't ask for perfection. When class began, the students watched Black with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know whether this new professor would be any better than the ones before. Black greeted them warmly. "Hello, everyone. I am Sirius Black, your Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. I think some of you already know me." He was exuberant, almost a little over the top. "I've looked into how this subject has been taught in previous years. Frankly, because of some well-known reasons, your learning has suffered, hasn't it?" He paused to gauge their reactions. Seeing attentive faces, he relaxed. "Since the end of last school year, the Ministry's Department of Education and the Wizarding Examinations Authority have reformed Defense Against the Dark Arts. They've added a practical combat component." He shrugged. "Personally, I think it's probably the wisest decision the Ministry has made since inception." Laughter rippled around the room. Black laughed with them, then grew serious. "It's particularly important for you fifth years. You'll be taking your OULs at the end of the year, so we've got our work cut out for us." The class went smoothly. Black's first lecture seemed a success. Under the new scheme, each lesson was 2 periods long, one for theory, one for practical training. Scott found Black's theoretical instruction solid. Though the professor could get excited and occasionally scatter his thoughts, he had real experience facing the dark arts, which made his lessons far more useful than mere rote learning. During the break, Black solicited feedback from the students and listened earnestly. Their praise clearly pleased him. "Professor Black should be grateful his first class are us, Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff," Roger said to Scott. "If his first students were Gryffindor and Slytherin, he wouldn't have it so easy." "Maybe Professor Snape will come to audit," Scott said with a smile. "For the Slytherin students' sake, to check whether their professor is up to scratch." Roger arched an eyebrow. "If Snape wants to, he can certainly come." When the break ended, Black signaled the start of the practical session. He waved his wand and a door appeared behind the podium. "Follow me," he said, opening it. "This will be your practical combat classroom." The students filed through and were surprised at how spacious the room was. "What do you think? Isn't it great?" Black asked with a grin. This classroom was expanded with Dumbledore's help using the undetectable extension charm. Roger looked around appreciatively. "We should ask Professor Black to move the dueling club here." Milton nodded. "Professor Black has plenty of practical experience. He fought Death Eaters. He might be willing to head the dueling club." Scott thought it a good idea. Professor Flitwick is busy. Black would be a solid choice. With Harry in the dueling club, I think he'd certainly agree. 280. Defense against the Dark Arts practical class. "It's a pity I didn't get to see your dueling practical exam at the end of last school year in June," Black said, casually flicking his hair. "Everyone knows I was still in Azkaban then." Scott immediately regretted mentioning Azkaban so flippantly. He'd underestimated how curious the Ravenclaws would be. If Black hadn't invited the topic, the students might have stayed tactful. But now, encouraged by Black's nonchalance, questions poured out. "Professor Black, is Azkaban really as terrible as the stories say?" "Professor, what exactly are Dementors? Are they magical creatures or something worse? If Dementors are that awful, how did you survive 12 years?" The Hufflepuffs watched with interest as well. Scott noticed Black visibly stagger under the barrage of questions. For a moment, the new professor looked struck, a pained expression passing across his face. 2 months out of Azkaban clearly hadn't been enough to erase 12 years of imprisonment. He forced himself to answer, then seemed to be pulled back into a terrible recollection. "Azkaban? It's not a good memory," he said haltingly. "Dementors. They're like devils. They bring only cold and darkness. They steal every scrap of happiness and leave nothing but endless pain." Seeing the class tense and surprised, Scott, as prefect, stepped forward. What had once been a matter he could observe impassively now required management. He smiled and spoke slowly, deliberately. "Thank you for your answer, Professor Black. That only makes us look forward to your practical class all the more. I hope you'll tell us about your duels with dark wizards." He slowed his voice on purpose. "A wizard with your combat experience is exactly what this class needs. Perhaps Headmaster Dumbledore has finally made a good choice." Scott's intervention quieted the students. Black recovered, gratitude softening his features as a calm smile returned. "Professor Flitwick mentioned you spontaneously formed a dueling club last semester," he said, scanning the classroom and the parchment with the student list. "Who among you performed best in that club?" "Scott! Cedric!" Ravenclaws called Scott's name. The Hufflepuffs, Cedric's. Black checked his list and said, "Very good, Mr. Trollope and Mr. Diggory." He turned to them. "I'd like both of you to duel as a demonstration, so I can see the level of your outstanding students." The other students stepped back, leaving Scott and Cedric facing one another. Cedric looked surprised and deferential. "Sorry, Professor. I'm not really as good as Scott." "No need for modesty, Mr. Diggory. Your performance has been excellent," Black replied, then waved his wand to clear the practice area and put Scott and Cedric into position. "Begin." "Expelliarmus." Cedric started with a disarming charm. "Smokescreen," Scott answered. He sensed Cedric's magic and sidestepped the charm, then wrapped himself in a thick cloud of smoke. Cedric tried to use Accio to shift the smoke away, but could not disperse it all. The smoke spread rapidly, swallowing the classroom and prompting complaints as pupils lost sight of the duel. In the obscurity, Scott ended the match decisively with Petrificus Totalis. A moment later, Black's voice cut through. "Tergio!" A rotating gust swept the room like a siphon. The smoke thinned, coalesced into a ball, and blew away. Vision returned to the classroom. "Finite incantatem," Black added, and he waved his wand to release the rigid Cedric. "Unfortunately, Mr. Diggory, that was not the most appropriate counter," Black told Cedric. "Against Mr. Trollope's smokescreen, a cleaning charm like Tergio is more effective indoors than Accio, which is better for pulling objects." He looked to Scott. "Well done, Mr. Trollope. Your smokescreen made full use of your magic sensing ability. But remember, that charm clears more easily inside buildings." Both boys thanked him for the advice. Scott hadn't expected a cleaning charm to be the best response indoors, yet that was part of what made magic interesting. Seemingly powerful spells could be countered by overlooked household charms or prank spells. It took experience and ingenuity to see those openings. Scott thought of times he'd used a Muggle-style muddle-headed charm to disrupt House Elf spatial magic, or a cheering charm to make Brandon Yaxley lose control of a fiendfire curse. For the rest of the period, Black had the class pair off and practice. He moved through the large practice room, correcting posture, offering tips, and demonstrating small techniques. Scott and Cedric, left without their usual house partners, paired up again at Cedric's request and began to spar, using Transfiguration rather than charms. Both had brought small materials for Transfiguration, and instead of casting direct spells, they animated transfigured animals to fight. The exchange reached a standstill for a while, each controlling its creatures with careful precision. "Congratulations, you've made real progress," Scott said after watching Cedric for a time. In the weeks apart over the summer, Cedric had clearly worked hard. He now controlled two animals with smooth, flexible coordination.